If you'd like to join us in the More Christ community, you can do so by becoming a patron over on Patreon, or you can support by becoming a member on YouTube. Either way, you'll get early access to new episodes, receive free ebooks each month, and are able to ask More Christ guests some of your burning questions. Thank you to my sponsor, Shea Blooms. Shea Blooms provides flower hire across Britain and Ireland. Hi, welcome to our Christ. I'm Marcus. Today I'm delighted to be joined by my friends Christian and George, who you might have seen on the channel before. We're going to have a free-flowing conversation about some themes that are very apropos to this channel, things that are happening in TLC and Estuary, and I really look forward to hearing both of their perspectives about things that are really on my heart and mind and have been for the last number of years with this channel. And I most look forward to the conversation, gents. And I just want to give you an opportunity, as said before we started recording, to introduce yourselves. You'll probably be familiar to many of the folks in TLC and who follow my channel. But if it's start with yourself, George, do you want to give them a little idea of who you are and what you're about?
Yeah, sure. I'm an educator with Kepler Education. I've been doing that for over a decade now, and I teach humanities there. Uh, really interested in narrative, identity, meaning, myth, and I'm also the executive director of the George Buchanan Forum, which is a sort of locally focused semi-annual conference, and which we kind of try to address some of those topics, but particularly related to things like political theology, history, and economics.
Excellent. And yourself, Christine?
Yeah, Christian Baxter. About 2 years ago, I hopped on the internet, started talking about things related to things that had impacted me, related to something like the meaning crisis. Figures like Jordan Peterson, Jonathan Peugeot, and John Vervaeke, and kind of hanging out in what's become known as like this little corner of the internet. Downstream from those guys, related to kind of a subculture and scene that's gathered around Paul Vanderklay, who kind of got his start, on talking about Jordan Peterson almost a decade ago, and how that was impacting culture and young people, or and people across the board. I have was a worship leader for most of my adult life, and then at 30, due to irresponsible and decisions, I quit being a worship leader. I was fired from that position and has spent the last 7, 8 years kind of rebuilding trust in my life with people, and with in my marriage and all those things. And that's been a large part of connecting to meaning and reconnecting to the Christian story and reality that had impacted my life so much up to that point. And those figures aforementioned played a big part in kind of regathering Christian identity in myself. And so I spent the last 2 years talking about that. And then last year, made a trip over to the United Kingdom, and stopped in at Galway, Ireland, and got to meet Marcus at the Christ and Culture conference that Paul Vanderklay was speaking at with Martin Shaw and Paul Kingsnorth. And then we went over and attended the ARC conference, and so got to cultivate more relationship with Marcus through that, and have just continued to have conversations in this space with people, maybe you could say, that are part of the liminal web, people that are kind of para-academic, meta-modern, and philosophy, and then Christianity, and really interested in how all those forces related to culture, related to liturgy and worship, and the Christian history and traditions all come together. So, and that was a long-winded way of saying hi. My name's Christian.
And I'm not an alcoholic, but I am addicted to Estuary. That's great, Kristen. Thank you so much. Thank you, George. Now, it's a pleasure to be with you, gents, and it was so fun to be together in Galway and in London, Kristen. And please God, we can get together in the future. Maybe we'll all go for a wee trip to Memphis, Tennessee, and survive.
That's right.
Let's do it.
So basically, I want to just play on what you spoke about there, Christine, this little corner of the internet, or TLC for short. And I suppose where do you think, or what do you think the state of TLC is now in 2026 after X number of years? Jordan Peterson's kind of zenith, maybe is what 2018 around that time, 2019, so on, and especially now with him going off the scene, so to speak, him being so ill and everything. But of course, then there's the element of PVK, who's set up the estuary protocol, and there's these events happening around America and in Ireland and the Netherlands and different places. I suppose I want to know your basic feel for where it is now compared to maybe where it was a few years ago, where it might go in the future. And then I'd love to share some of the my experiences from an Irish context. I suppose I'll do that for starters, sure, and then you can play off this in whatever way you want. So basically, in our context, it's maybe different from the a lot of the kind of estuary groups that you have across the states in that many of us, or all of us, I think actually now are Christian. Like there was a guy who was agnostic, sort of atheist, who then became a believing Christian. But now it's very much inter-Christian, which has its virtues, especially in the part of the world that we're in, and Catholics, Protestants coming together and having these deep conversations, and it's organic, it's not top down, it's not forced, and so on. So I think it's a real gift. But because it's inter-Christian, that's allowed us to focus more on discipleship, and the conversations are different than you might have if you have a number of atheists, agnostics, and so on in your group. And I think we have made a conscientious effort to go beyond the kind of thinky talky stuff, to go out and hill walk together and have meals and all this kind of stuff. And I know some of the other ones are doing that too, but there's a certain element where it's formative now, and mutually enriching in a distinctly Christian and discipling sense, I would say. And we're talking about actually going to some of the old kind of, what do we call it, a abandoned sites in Ireland where we might offer liturgies and so on,
Mm.
which is kind of cool for me. So I don't know what you guys get out of Estuary and TLC on your end, but from my perspective, I would like to see us go down that route in this part of the world, and love to hear what you guys think from your end.
Well, um, I think a couple of things. One of the this little corner, I think even at one point early on, like Jonathan Majot would say that on occasion, and John Vervaeke, but they're kind of developing their own things, and um, in the way that Paul Vanderklay went about cultivating community across kind of the digital ways of YouTube and Discord and group chats and those types of things, wasn't really the aim of some of the kind of bigger thinkers. They are doing their own versions of development, but the TLC has, but that was the kind of the germ for that, the kind of foundation for that was obviously the Jordan Peterson phenomenon, roughly 2016 to 2018, phase one, and then post COVID phase two, and now phase three, 2025, he drops off the radar. And I think there is kind of an identity crisis that is having to be dealt with, related to how things formulate, how things continue to exist in certain ways. And I know Paul is in kind of he's spoke openly on his channel about possible changes that are coming for him, like vocationally. And so where he's able to put emphasis and time, and as things do seem to organize themselves, because somebody once said that hierarchies are as old as the trees. I don't know if y'all remember that from Jordan Peterson, but so these things exist from whether they're whether the hierarchies are kind of implied or explicit, things still generally function that way. And so I think that it is in transition, you could say. And somebody had a critique recently that attended the Midwest Estuary Conference up in Chicago, someone that had been kind of newer to the scene, I guess you could say, and kind of was coming a little bit at arm's length to see if what this was about. And in that form or that iteration of this corner and estuary, he saw it as something that seemed decadent, which is funny to say about something that's pretty ragtag in its makeup to a degree. But I think he also saw there was for me something that stood out was there was something called like the OG random estuary, and it was a group of people, about 12 people that were on stage doing kind of an estuary, but it was kind of this first iteration of people that were coming up and having conversations about things that were deeply meaningful, and it was kind of like, okay, well, that was something that happened. Okay, now this is happening now. Somebody that was active then, but that is still very active, because many of those people aren't active anymore, is Luke Thompson, and he kind of represents kind of a narrative figure that ties in what was going on now, because he still hosts a lot of live streams on the internet related to kind of that initial generation of the scene. And so whether he knows that or not, I kind of have my perspective on how, when I came into looking at it to about 2 years ago, what was formulating. And so what's funny about certain things like this is how they're held, how things are held together when things aren't formalized or very, kind of, it's kind of a small group of people that do things, and what the people then attach their attention to. So someone told me that, Christian, man, you really took a lot of responsibility, and I didn't see myself as doing that, but I guess something about it came across that way. I was just kind of doing some exploration, and so that's part of what I think's been happening. And I've also, through conversations and things even that have been shared like publicly, is that there's been some more, should we formalize some things? I think Paul has gone into some different maybe group chats, or like to just continue to put emphasis on how informal this whole thing has been. Not kind of pressed down from the top as a high structure. And early on in the TLC's history, from what I understand, there was a lot of pressure for Paul to become more explicit, as like name people, get people to do things, make things, structure things. And he's resisted and resisted and resisted that. Not maybe because it wasn't something he was not totally unwilling to do, but possibly because the longer you're able to do that, the more something can continue to, like, I guess, exist in the spirit in which it was, birthed. But like many things, time has a way of doing things and causing external pressures, and do you want something to continue to exist? Sometimes you have to cross thresholds. And so I see 2026 as something along those lines. And you can kind of look at some of these other people that have been mentioned. You can talk about Jordan Peterson, talk about Jonathan Peugeot and John Pervecki, have formalized different things. I mean, I think Symbolic World Press looks a lot different in what Jonathan Peugeot, if you're paying attention, like what he's doing now looks a lot different than what he was doing 2 years ago. And that's just another piece of this question and this relationship to something like the market. And I think that it's an interesting relationship, and something that, from my perspective, I've even had a recent conversation with a guy. He goes by Bob the Baptist on YouTube, and he's got an interesting channel called Brave New Tube. Had my second conversation with him, and really kind of was pushing on this, because that really is the question of like these spaces, the digital space versus, say, the estuary space, which is the embodied space, Marcus, that you were talking about, has moved into, we don't just sit here and talk, we want to take these ideas and embody them through types of pilgrimage, through types of different things. And I know you've talked with Rafe Kelly before and had those kind of conversations about embodiment. But the digital space still exists as it does. And I think that's something more linked to this corner of the internet, is what is going on in the digital space, and where will things look like in, this year, the next year. I do think that if something's to survive, there's something about Vervaeke's salience that's related to the market, that's related to what I was saying about what Bob the Baptist asked me about directly, was Do you think that the market or that TLC seems to be more self-aware of what it means to be doing things on the internet? Um, Kind of that whole navel gaze conversation of looking at yourself a little bit, but it's being conscious of there's forces at play. And if you're just following whatever best practice or whatever even the app wants you to do, it's going to lead you to a certain direction. Um, and so something that I've been trying to do is like be conscious about that. Something like when I hit 500 and I was like, well, I'm subs, I was like, I'm gonna turn on memberships, not because I think that I'm gonna try to just grow my membership section, because if I don't, it's gonna like weigh on me in a kind of way subconsciously. And that's just like an example of then like having the conversation about that, having this relationship to these tools that are related to the market, that are related to profilicity, having a profile on the internet and all these things going out. So I think that the corner is still going to be maybe wrestling with that, at least from my perspective. I don't know.
Mm. Thanks, Christian. And I'd appreciate your perspective, George. I suppose before we had this conversation, you describe yourself as kind of tangential to TLC and not really
I think
deeply in it, but you've always got deep thoughts to share on folks like Paul Kingsnorth and some of these folks that are very much at the forefront of the conversations that many of us are having in TLC and so on. And maybe especially in line with what Christian's describing, coming from your background with classical education and so on, and how that is managed, say with Kepler education, folks like that. What opportunities do you see for the likes of TLC in that respect?
yeah. Wow. I mean, yeah, that was a lot there, Christian. Thank you for that. And yeah, and my hesitation to accept the TLC moniker is not it. That's not. I don't think the TLC would recognize me as TLC. That's so I hesitate to make claims where I can't actually back it up. And so I've enjoyed the TLC extensively and have followed it for a number of years. But man, yeah, there was so much there, Christian. I and as an educator, as a teacher, thinking about how do we interact with these structures that we're embedded in, right? If the goal here is ultimately soul formation, how do I do that as an educator? How do I do that as a teacher? How do I do that as a human being who's interacting with other human beings, in which my number one job as an individual here is to orient myself towards my final end, the fulfillment of my nature. And TLC and Estuary have been very enjoyable experiences for me to see that interaction. One of the things that we have to, riffing on some of the comments that you had made there, Christian, that we're bumping up against, it seems, is that so we exist within a machine society, and it's asking us to become quantifiable so that it can measure us. And in doing so, it's providing incentives for us to actually give it feedback that is essentially not even just a reduced down version of what it means to be human, but just a very shallow version of our humanity, right? We want to be able to measure your reactions, which is to ask you to reduce your emotional responses to like 5 various quantifiable states. However many emojis there are in the Facebook social media site. We've got basically, we've got happiness, mediocre, like, anger, frustration, wow. And so it's like, okay, can we reduce all of our human experience to these quantifiable emotions so that we can actually incorporate you into this giant machine institution, so then we can steer the ship into a particular direction. And one of the problems that we have then when we interact in social media and on the internet, where we're spending so much of our lives now, is that we are engaging with other human beings on the machine terms. And when we are practicing these when we're engaging in these cultic practices, which is essentially a shallow version of ourselves, do we actually then become that at some level where it's like I eventually find myself becoming simply an avatar of my humanity and of my own particularity? And that then when I go and I interact with other human beings, I approach them as avatars. And at some level, we actually have reduced ourselves to that. Right? This isn't even just this isn't something that the machine has imposed upon us and we exist within that. When I leave the machine space, am I actually able to rediscover my humanity? If I've been engaging in these practices, you mentioned Christian attention. If my attention has been oriented towards these particular, you said, rites of practice, that when I leave the machine space, I'm still that avatar. And one of the things that I've appreciated with engaging in estuary, like here locally, or being able to witness TLC interaction online, is that at some level we're asking one another to try to re-engage with each other as human beings. And if you've ever sat with somebody who is experiencing deep loss, sorrow, and grief, the thing that they so frequently don't need is for someone to come up and provide them with data and information or a trite response. They don't need to know this too shall pass. And what they require at that moment is for another human being to come along and actually experience that grief with them and say, "Oh, I'm engaging with you. I'm experiencing you and how you perceive reality. We're at a level, our souls are connecting, and we're experiencing this together. There's actually a real union of soul here." And that's something that AI cannot replace. But when we're reducing ourselves to avatars, we're losing the ability to actually engage like that. And estuary is trying to reorient our attention and our practices of attention so that A, you can't give a trite response, and B, it's also saying, okay, I have to just live with this person's experience with their journey. And one of the things that I've also enjoyed with it is so much of the destination is assumed. There's a common vocabulary that people have developed, a common attention, a way of seeing reality and being able to experience it, such that we're not trying to manipulate one another towards a particular goal, but we're actually to witness and experience empathetically the journey that we're on together. And that can sound trite, but at some level, like, that's what it means to engage with other humans as a human being, right? We're trying to lead one another to Christ, ultimately. And whatever journey, whatever path they're on to doing that, at one fundamental level, the best I can do is to be there for another person, even when they're struggling in that path.
Hmm.
I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
Oh, thanks, George. And do you think then, Christian, in light of that, now that we're almost a year after the fact, well, not quite, but coming towards a year after the ARC conference, and there'll be another one now in a few months, that the conference displayed some of those characteristics of the machine? I know we spoke a bit about that in the past, but now with a bit of time passed, what prospects do you see for the ARC project of Peterson, especially in his absence, for example? And I think from my perspective too, I wouldn't be drawn to go back to it. I think it did succumb in key ways to some of the things that George is describing, the kind of political shibboleths, like Kemi Badenoch talking about progress and these things on the stage was very cringeworthy. But even though I met a lot of wonderful people there, and obviously got to spend time with the likes of yourself and a few other kind of Christian influencers, for lack of a better word. But are the incentive structures there to lend itself to something that's going to be genuinely glorifying to God, even implicitly edifying for people and so on? Or do you think that ship has sailed, so to speak?
Yeah, I think I'm gonna go back to kind of the way that I view stuff like that. Has been informed by the experience of coming to age at the same time that Apple was having its great revolution and impact on society. I got an iPod when I was in college, and I bought a MacBook Pro. Took out a student loan to buy 2000 circa 2005 or whatever. Like, what we can get for. I mean, it's like it was stupid, but and then the iPhone comes out in 2007, and then iPad, and Apple is not the same company without Steve Jobs. Still great company, still great, does interesting things. But even, they made I know that they just signed with Google for Gemini to be, I think, their part of their Apple Intelligence. Um, why did I say that? You look at these patterns, you look at like, what is Arc without Jordan Peterson? Um, it's not the same. Even if he was, it can still go on. It can still do some interesting things. It can still, but I just think that a lot of times we want to think, he wasn't technically the founder. I know it's Baron, the Baron, I can't remember, Philippa. There's other things that are at play at that. But from my perspective, even talking about the corner and stuff like that, there's seasons to things. There's seasons to how the kind of the initial spark of these things. Things will be iterative and things will continue to have impact and to go out. But the same with Arc related to Jordan Peterson. I just don't think it has. It will be one. What is it? Factor of something removed from a cultural phenomenon that took place, like a story that was continuing on, and that's kind of how I see that related. And by one order of magnitude, I think that's the phrase I was looking for. But like, it's removed from kind of this cultural story that has been going for the last almost 10 years. And so I think that will play a part in whatever Arc can do. I do think that culturally, across the board is becoming looking to a more religious culture, and so I do think Arc will probably follow that trend. Even this young guy that's coming up in politics, I think he's from Texas. He's a Democrat, and he's just on Ezra Klein's podcast. He kind of passes the Christian sniff test upon first pass, but he's part of the he's a Democrat or whatever, and it just, for me, and that maybe you could say it like the left or whatever are probably looking for religious figures, even Christian religious figures, to embrace because of what's happening, the spirit of the age and the zeitgeist related to what that's been doing in culture. And so I think Arc will probably follow in that trend, but I don't know if it will continue in that way with Peterson, and maybe it couldn't have in a certain way. I don't know, but those are some initial thoughts related to that. I think the other parts, just to kind of take it back to a few other thoughts along the lines of what's going on. There was Karen Wong has long-standing conversation channel in this corner, and she recently she kind of did a rando with a young man she met at it was called Southeastuary Conference, that Nate Heil from Grail Country kind of spearheaded in I think it was North Carolina about this past fall, and he brought up the term electracy, which was kind of coined by Greg Ulmer back in the 90s. And I was totally taken with the concept. And I think it really connects to things that we're experiencing. And sometimes maybe the conversation in this little corner the question is, what are we doing here? What is it that we're actually doing? And I also had a great conversation with Daniel from OG Rose, runs a philosophy channel, OG Rose. And these two things kind of overlap. One is that we are developing a type of literacy that is electric or digital. And that's what the word electracy is not. It's not literacy, being literate of writing. It's being literate of this type of medium. And you can see this in things like kind of the popular Gen Z TikTok edits. And even and this is so strange, but as my daughter, who I recently, me and my wife, she's 16 and we allowed her to get an Instagram. And she starts sending us reels and we're having this kind of conversation in our DMs with our daughter that is actually, and I haven't said this anywhere, but it's actually helping us know her better. Because her interests are becoming more salient by the things that she's either kind of resharing or that she's saying, hey, or we're reconnecting on this. It's doing something interesting to our relationship. And it's through this electronic literacy of her just jumping into this pond and knowing how to share. And so, which is a new phenomenon, like that, the rite of passage to be able to like have a meme language with your parents. That's pretty new. It's brand new for us. And of course, Jonathan Haidt would probably say she doesn't ever need to have a phone until she's 20. And Paul Kingsnorth would say, get all your phones out of your house. But like, but we're walking through that. And, but that's like electracy. And then another interesting part of what are we doing online, that OG Rose, which I'm excited to maybe purchase one of his books about belonging. And he really references, I think his name's Philip Reef. His last name's Reef a lot. And I'm interested in kind of learning more about his work. But this kind of academic adjacent culture, philosophical space, you see this has played out in two different ways, where so much of what's happening in this kind of podcast reality is people are getting to overhear conversation. And he hearkened that back to when he was a young boy and going to the diner with his dad and his grandpa and his uncle, and they would sit and talk, and he got to overhear this interesting conversation. And now there's a version of that gets into decadence, and to take that back to like Jordan Peterson's move, and there's all sorts of conversations about his move to go to the Daily Wire, which isn't what I'm here to talk about, but the thing about when they were like having these conversations, like they were like a steak dinner, and it's Jonathan Peugeot and Jordan Peterson talking about Western civilization, or it was Shapiro and Peters. There was this, and I think maybe Bishop Barron did one too, but it's like, that's very decadent overhearing. And you're like looking through the window. You can imagine a young, kid out in the cold, and there's window and there's frost around the pane, and you're looking in and you can hear what they're saying, but it's like, man, we are in two different worlds. Something about this little corner of the internet with, low res webcams and those types of things. Like you're getting to overhear a conversation, but you feel like, maybe somebody's like doing their laundry while they're talking or something. It's like, it's a very different way to overhear a conversation, and it may still touch on some of the big ideas that were being discussed by A. Peterson or Bishop Barron or whoever. But it doesn't come across nearly as distant. And there's, early conversation I had about with a friend I met on here named Pete from Strange Theology, and it's like, oh man, he'd listened to so much Rogan, and he was like, there's so many times I wish I was just be able to sit into that conversation, and then it's like, well, maybe you can start some of those conversations, maybe you can have some of those conversations. It's something about the corners, like I said, blue collar kind of sensibility of being able to just be like, I don't have to be quote unquote important to maybe have an interesting conversation like that. And again, like, but then can you take that? Can you take that magic and then can you craft it and then can you market it and then can you like reproduce it and then can you sell it and then can it be? And I think that is the constant kind of, oh man, listening to Jonathan Pageau and Jordan Peterson talk about symbolic meaning and metaphor and archetypal this and cosmic this, and it's like, oh, and it's they're on webcams. And then it's like, now we're seeing like, well, you've already seen Peterson Academy, but you're seeing Symbolic World. Like, can we harness this? Can we? And that's not a critique. I'm just saying, like, you kind of have these. I think, George, you were talking about that. Like, you didn't use telos, but you were talking about where these things aim. So that's some of the maybe perspective.
Yeah. Yeah, and the concern that it's like at a certain point, if you are following the spirit of the age, which is quantification, and quantification equals growth. I mean, if you want to see the number on the graph, the arrow on the graph go up, therefore equals good. And you're like, okay, so then we're asking us to take hierarchies, which, like you mentioned, it's like, okay, that's essential, it's necessary to have hierarchical organization and structure, but then to create as this increases in scale, to create these institutions of size. And then what happens when the institution becomes institutionalized to the point of where the quantity has become a quality of its own. And now what you're describing is there is a filter between my experience that doesn't exist in an embodied interaction when somebody has got the grainy video cam and they're doing their laundry there, or I'm down on my knees doing tiling and there's so much. This is getting back to even that whole issue of like interacting and embodiment, because we're entering the space between places with our maps in hand, our low resolution maps of how we perceive reality. And in some sense, it's kind of like when we're entering into that land, we're entering into a land of the Fae, and the goal is to go in and come back with knowledge from it. You're not supposed to go in and eat the fruit that's there and then live there. You're supposed to come back. So we enter in with our maps. And our maps don't necessarily change, not directly or necessarily intentionally, but we're finding out through interacting with other human beings in this space, like how the maps can relate or exist with one another. So, that even gets back to kind of that question. I forget who it was who asked it, but it might have been Luke. Does anyone change their mind in the TLC? No, it wasn't Luke. I forget. I'm sorry. Forget who it was who had said that. But so we're coming back with the maps, but we're understanding how they interact and relate to other maps. And the fact, I'm thinking of the Iris Murdoch quote that the goal of stories is to discover that other people exist. And so we're like, okay, I have my map. Now, how do I take it and play and interact and engage with other maps, with other human beings? So how do I take the information and the interactions in the digital space, the space between places, such that when I re-enter into place, I'm now actually able to understand how this can be used to, what I was talking about earlier, be more human with other humans. So, and there was something else that you had mentioned about just the conundrum of that institutionalization that can occur, and I've been thinking about this a lot also, so I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. And whether this is large-scale institutions, whether this is ecclesiastical structures or civil government, we have this issue of, we have the society, we have the people, and the people are being motivated and driven along by a spirit, right? And whether we're following the spirit of Jordan Peterson or PVK, and we're like, okay, there's a will here that's kind of holding our attention together. And what happens when that spirit either changes because it accepts the narrative of the machine and just pursues growth for growth's sake. And then that was what I was getting at when I was mentioning that we have a shift from just quantity to quality difference here now. And so how do we interact with that? And or what happens if that spirit just eventually begins to shift towards different interests? I think you were getting at that. And I I love the decentralized nature of the TLC, and I think that that actually needs to be leaned into. And the problem that we have is that, and this is just human interaction, human nature. We're like, oh, there was something about, Jordan Peterson 2018 that I love. Can we capture that somehow? That lightning in a bottle? Can we bottle it up and close it with the law, with rules, with structure, and make sure that the spirit doesn't change, so that everyone else and wherever they're wanting to take it, like they are being reoriented towards my appreciation of 2018 Jordan Peterson? Or can we try to institute more structure around Paul Vanderklay, so that we can try to maintain the spirit of the TLC to make sure that it doesn't get out of control? And so you have that give and take relationship between, okay, we have a center and then these borders, and what's the relationship there? When we're trying to maintain the center at a particular time and place, if the collective spirit is not actually going in that direction, can we preserve it through more law?
Thanks, George. I suppose from my perspective, listening to those two elements, what comes up to in my mind is how TLC can incorporate, say, a younger generation, younger demographic, and maybe even more females. I don't know if you see the same thing, but it does seem to be very male heavy. You mentioned the likes of Karen Wong, wonderful female member of TLC. They do exist, thank God. But it's self-selected and it's very cerebral types to tend to go. And I wonder how to integrate the positive Christian elements that are coming through. I don't know if either of you have come across this young girl, a Gen Z lady, influenced very much by Paul Kingsnorth, convert to Eastern Orthodoxy from India. I listened to her give an interview on Unheard a few weeks ago. She made some great points. It kind of ties in some ways, I think, with what you described, Christian, that in the past maybe I was guilty of being kind of snobbish about how, say, text language and so on, how you would break things down to very simplistic means of communicating. But then I listened to McWhorter talk about it and then started to appreciate the pros and cons to different forms of communication. And it's not all negative. And I think that Instagram kind of thing that you mentioned needn't be negative whilst being cognizant of those temptations that you're describing, George. And I wonder how can we make use of those technologies, say like Instagram, more visual, like reels and things like that, which aren't the long form kind of Joe Rogan, Jordan Peterson, 2 hour conversations, so on, so that it's again glorifying to God, edifying to others, and so on. And so yeah, serves God's kingdom without being sucked into the machine, as you say. And I think part of my resistance to going down Kingsnorth's route entirely is that I think he maybe overstates the problem. And if you accept that framing, then it might, maybe I'm wrong, lend itself to kind of Gnosticism, that we have to escape this machine. And how do we do that? Is it this kind of Again, it's interesting. Like it's got the language of being very earthy and so on, but it's really very cerebral. I think that sort of retreating to the bush and formed by the Romanian Orthodox monks and things like that. It's like it's a bit of a there's fantastical elements to that, I think, and it kind of imagine, as far as I can see, imagines a world that didn't necessarily really exist in the simplistic form that, say, a lot of the orthobros think it did. And from my perspective, it is getting a certain balance with these new technologies and God being manifest through the Instagram reels or what have you. I don't know what you guys think of that, and prospects and pitfalls to to that end, you know?
Yeah, so try to go through some of those. First, going back to the first thing about other people doing things versus, and whether that's Gen Z and women, and um it's, I found that doing church work, and again kind of talking about these, I'll just take back to the person that popularized these ideas into the conversation space in a way that was able to be salient and grabbed on. Jordan Peterson talked about Pareto distribution. I don't know if y'all remember,
Oh
he'd
yeah.
say that like every other conversation.
Mhm.
um why is it that whatever percent get like of wealth or talent, but there's also kind of that 80-20, like 20% of the people are doing 80% of the work, in a lot of organizational structure, and so again, when you talk about these things, can you get the can TLC, quote unquote, what is TLC? Is it really like, can these 7 or 8 people do, you know, make reels or be, and so to move on to that idea about the what is going on there with the short form and the long form, because I just saw Matt Damon and
Mm.
um, um, Ben Affleck on Rogan. I watched
How
almost
did
the
you
whole
like
thing.
that?
I loved it, actually,
Okay, I haven't seen it yet.
because for multiple reasons. Weirdly enough, this is an example to me of Trump making America more sane. Because whenever you're calling Joe Rogan an extremist, 5 years ago, and maybe even those two players might have even kind of thought that, why 5 years later are they on his program that Trump was actually on? And they probably didn't vote for him. Maybe they, secret. I doubt it. What's going on there? I think it's very fascinating, and that's an example of, um, this is beside the point, but just that conversation happened was very fascinating to me. They made a joke about being communists, and like, of why they are doing a certain kind of incentive structure to their new kind of production studio for film. But it was just them having that conversation with Joe Rogan, knowing what he's gone through, what he represents, and even though he's not, it, you know, it just it made me feel something like there's this reminds me of something that took place like a decade ago, that stopped taking place for about 5 or 6 years, that maybe is happening again, because not because they agree, because Trump is an extreme in certain ways, but because of him being that way, it makes, oh, Joe's not as extreme as I thought he was. Like it puts things into a perspective that I think is actually good. Plus, they're trying to get their business to 1 million people, and it's got 3 million views after 2 days. So I mean, it's like, then there's the pragmatic capitalist metrics thing that's also at play. But it was a cool conversation. So in that they talked about media and long form and short form, and Netflix versus the theater and all these kind of things that we're playing. That Damon's talking about going to the movie theater being a lot like a church event. Like, you get your kids ready, and then you come in and you experience all your attention is set. I mean, that was interesting. Um, they, but the part about what are we doing with short form TikTokification? Like, I'll just, for instance, whatever I do, like, I use StreamYard to do these kind of conversations, and it'll automatically generate shorts clips for YouTube. Like, and then you can just punch it and send it over if you like it as a part of the section. And I'm not sitting there racking my brain. What was the best minute and a half of this conversation? I've got to get it perfect. I'm not even like, I'm just like, no, this one, oh, that was pretty good. Sends it over there. And I just see it's like, it's like this alternative path of connecting people to something that, and I'm not putting a lot of emphasis on like the creation of it. I'm just kind of, okay, this was a really salient point for me, or somebody told me this was a really salient point. I'll put that out there in relationship to the conversation. And it's, that's different than like aiming at this to be, can this go viral? And will this have turnover for subscriptions or whatever, however all those things work. And Grim Grizz actually has been talking about this on different live streams and things I've done. He's mentioned this at different times of, if we do think something's good here, why are we not on TikTok? What do you do? What is that? What is that relationship? Are you purposely trying to hide? Are you, or be, try to go beneath the radar of something, or, that relationship, which is, quite frankly, the relationship, when I start hearing stuff like that, it rings evangelicalism bells in my head, which are like, well, if we have the good news, I'll do anything short of sin to get this out to, to get as many people exposed to this. And so then all the emphasis actually gets put on the anything short of sin thing that you did, like riding a roller coaster across the stage to get people's attention to come to church or something. So it's like, so then the emphasis is actually on like, what's this thing that we can do? And then, oh yeah, it's to get people to hear the gospel or something like that. But all this energy is put into the anything short of sin. And so, related to TikToks and trying to get information to people that way, or what's appropriate. It does come back down to this, into the digital space of asking, what is my relationship to this? What it's like, not looking at this as like a pragmatic, but like, how am I relating to this? And then to your point, George and Marcus, how does this have a relationship to my life? I have these, it's easy to talk in the idea space and become idealistic. I've struggled with this personally. Oh man, I love what Eastern Orthodox are doing here. And oh man, this Catholic thing about the divine feminine, like, oh man. And then it's like, okay, yeah, if people just knew. Okay, so I get into a relationship and church environment with people, and it's like, it doesn't just go one-to-one. Like, what is the relationship with these ideas, and how does that come into contact with the people that I'm in community with, the people, even like that I go to church with, the people I worship with, people that I lead in worship. And so, I think that's a piece at play. The TLC Gen Z woman, Marcus, did you say that Frey India is a recent convert to Orthodoxy from Kingsnorth? Is that what you said?
Well, I don't know how recent, but yes, she's Eastern Orthodox, and she cited Paul Kingsnorth specifically as a key influence.
I didn't really. I've listened to her on Chris Williamson. She was at ARC. I saw her in the distance a few times while we were there, and I think she writes for Unheard. She's an interesting young lady, traditional values. And, she's very beautiful. She has all the characteristics of somebody that could easily use social media for attention, like on that. And she has chosen to use it to encourage young women to consider the pitfalls of these types of things. And so I think that's interesting. I did have a conversation with a young lady I met at ARC who was a Gen Z person. And she had worked for Tony Erickson on does that name sound recognized? Yeah. Mm-hmm. She'd worked for her organization, and then she's kind of like, at the last I talked to her, kind of was trying to do something else, but she was at ARC because she was, I think she had a little bit of a bone to pick with wokeness as well, but it's just like, but for other reasons. And it does seem like there is something related to Gen Z that has to do with a clear conviction to really cut through. I know you recently had on Richard Redeem Zoomer, Marcus. Somebody that agree with all his theses or not, lots of conviction in his articulation of his ideas and in theology. And I think that's a piece of that. And then the last piece you mentioned, Kingsnorth being like almost like a anti-gnostic, like the Gnostic. I think about when I hear about Gnosticism. At this point, I think a lot about the Matrix being kind of a Gnostic metaphor in so many ways. So it's like, but is there also a sense in which it could also the relationship or the anti-ness of this dearth could also lead into a certain Gnostic tendency, and I'm interested in that. I hadn't really framed framed it that way, but yeah, those are some of those ideas.
Yeah, I think two things just to respond briefly to your point about Freya India. She did mention in the interview that I saw that she specifically refused to use Instagram as that would be marketing herself in line with what you describe as her physical beauty and so on, and focused her attention on Substack because she believed in the ideas. I thought that was wonderful and commendable and in line with what you described about young redeemed Zoomer and that kind of authenticity to that cringy modern kind of word. And then I suppose the other thing is just for me on the Gnostic front, I suppose, yes, that's the way I'm sort of conceptualizing it rightly or wrongly now at the moment. And also drawing on this idea of ressentiment from Nietzsche and
Mm.
folks like that. And I've been listening to a podcast recently where they're doing a deep dive in Scheller and a kind of Christian post-Nietzschean kind of history and so on, All Heart and a few guys, and they like I don't want to make everything ressentiment. It's the same like with Girardians. I don't
Yeah.
make everything a mimetic theory, But I do think if we get too inordinately focused on the machine, say or things like that, maybe that's an example of ressentiment or something like it. Where we are. It's another Age of Hitler thing where we're too focused on the negative, but we're not offering an integrated positive vision that I think, and more than just vision, practices, spiritual practices, and some of these things that we're reaching for in TLC and habits of worship and orienting ourselves to the truth, the good and the beautiful, and so on. And from my perspective, I don't see the kind of rad trad or the orthobro stuff or the whatever Protestant equivalents that are manifesting as being the way to go, or at least like not the primary way to go for many of us, and so on. Just I'm kind of curious about what maybe you folks think about that, and maybe if we hear from you, George.
Yeah, yeah, I really appreciate your comment about the both the resentment and yeah, not wanting to fall into the Girardian trap of seeing everything through that lens. Um, but and so kind of maybe tying both Christian's last comments there with your question. Uh, is one of the concerns about TikTok, the TikTokification and the Instagramification of our our vision of our attention is what I was mentioning earlier with the concern that we're going to that will actually mold how we then perceive reality outside of the space between places, such that I remember there was an individual who's also he's a teacher, and he used to perform an exercise with students where he would have them look at a great work of art and just sit in silence with it for a couple minutes and just kind of be present with it. And students would do this, and very similar to Martin Shaw's question of like, don't try to analyze, deconstruct, or theorize the story that we've just heard. It's like just hear the story and then experience yourself in the story. And so here's this work of art, and students would come away from this exercise talking about what a profound experience this was. And over the last couple of years, that has begun to change, such that he said students they don't enjoy the experience, and they're not able to do it. And so that concern that by again engaging in these practices where we shape our attention, does that then mean that we're unable to actually engage with other human beings and with art and beauty and love outside of the internet. So that being one of the concerns there, where the message is at some level not independent of the medium, like you're mentioning about this young lady deciding to forego something like TikTok or Instagram and focus instead on Substack. And so when you're talking about ressentiment and again, that question of, is it shaping our desires? Is it turning them into our emotional responses? I mean, you see this obviously with, something like porn, where like, okay, my interaction with another human being is being reduced now to just this single, real quick click, performative. I'm being asked to consume another human being, essentially. And we're doing that at quantifiable levels all over the internet with all of our emotional responses. And then the concern there is that we're like, okay, does that mean that we want to then ditch the medium altogether? And I totally agree with you, Marcus, that we're like, okay, there may be good here that actually is important and necessary for us to salvage from this. But as our desires and loves are being driven and shaped by the interests of the machine, do we have time and the ability to self-analyze and ask, okay, what is salvageable from this, or what ought we to preserve from this, while at the same time, whatever portion of ourself that is doing that analyzing, is that self independent from how it has been shaped by the machine itself? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And then with the concerns with ressentiment, what is it that Nietzsche believed that he could explain Christianity based on ressentiment, where it's like, okay, here's an ethical structure that Christians have cultivated because of their stance to the other. And he thought that could explain the origin of Christian love, right? The spirit that's driving Christianity. And if you stop to think about it, it's like, okay, well, that obviously is not how we actually function when we're talking about true transcendental love, which is what Christianity is asking us to engage in. And so ultimately, and this gets back to my comments about the spirit that's guiding us, it's like that spirit has to be one of genuine love for the eternal, right? That has to be what's guiding then our interactions in the space between places and our interactions with other human beings. It's the one that colors and shapes all of what we engage in, and hopefully that's the saving grace from ressentiment. So, I don't know if you have thoughts about that.
Well, I definitely don't know who ressentiment is, but I have the least number of books in my background, so take that for what it's worth. But
You do want to be getting down that quantitative route that George mentioned earlier?
Yeah. Don't measure
In the
that.
background.
They're all kids' books, Christian. They're all board books.
So I want to address some of the points, Marcus, you brought about kind of the rad trad versus the integrative whole. I think about Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King, which is the day that we're recording this, but in America. But the Martin Luther, and I think about his formation as a Catholic, and then trying to do this thing that becomes Lutheranism, and Protestantism's relationship to something like Catholicism, and you could put Eastern Orthodoxy in there, but this at some point is the rebellious son, like, does he ever recognize that he looks like his dad? Does he ever recognize that maybe his dad had some wisdom, but he's making his own way in the world? Like it's not, and he is now something else, but he's not. He is his father. Somebody's not his father. It's like this relationship to, all these you mentioned authenticity, but this conviction, the online rad trad versus integrated whole is like some of those people are older. And I think about, you know, how much Catholicism did Luther bring to what he was trying to do. Like, and we look at these two separate things, but and there was so much going on in the culture at the time, and I'm not a historian. This is my Petersonian psychological takes. And, I think the guys, who is it? Tom Holland's podcast, what's the rest is history? Is that his? And they went on the Martin Luther was a bipolar, question. But I'm really just trying to say that something like all these converts, and even a lot of millennial or Gen X converts, like to tradition, more ancient traditional paths, Christian paths, is a couple of things are happening, but you are not just like shedding your Protestant skin and putting on a Catholic skin. You are bringing all of who you were and are and were formed into these spaces. And that recognition is what allows to make more of the integrative whole. Like, oh man, I need to repent from all of my Protestant. Like, okay, like where did your Christian imagination come from? Like, I think like, and there that could be answered multiple ways. Like maybe some of it came from Dungeons and Dragons, and some of it came from Skyrim, and some of it came from Sunday school at First Baptist Church. But like, there's again, this word relating to, but you go into this to become fully integrated as a, convert to one of those more historical faiths. You have to deal with and be able to, I think, love the part of you in the goodness. And you look at these things on a pragmatic level and take it to more of like the market level, people like, I think it's Father Stephen Damick, I think he did, and he did Lord of Spirits podcast with Father DeYoung, but like he was a live production guy for either live events or for like evangelical churches. And he just got hired to be like the digital media director for like Ancient Faith, something or another. And it's like, what are you doing there? Like there's a relationship, and like so I think that's, that's just one like kind of like pattern or symbol, but there's like a relationship to where we come from and where we're going. And the rad trad thing is like everything's anathema back there in a lot of ways, and it's like, and I can talk to you about my mother-in-law who was raised Catholic, and her brother is an archbishop in the Catholic Church and had two sisters that were a nun, and that she never went back to the Catholic Church for her own reasons. Like, so, we can play that game all day long. And so, so I think that's part of, there's a big conversation about how we relate to where we've come from in the rad trad versus the integrative whole. And that, to Marcus, is your point. Like there's something else. There's got to be another kind of aim. And then the liminal versus the embodied space. And I've already used this word. And I think, Marcus, you've had conversations with Michael Sophiologist. I can't remember his last name. Sophiologist Michael Martin.
No, Michael Martin.
And it's like he deals a lot with the Christian imagination, if I'm not incorrect. But that's been something that I've been thinking a lot about. And I think King's North or Martin Shaw, obviously Joe, like they, that's a big part, the fairy tales, but that's the younger generations, and something I think that I speak to, related the relationship to something like big evangelicalism. Like, what forms your Christian imagination if you were kind of in the last 20 years born in a mega church? And like, what is your idea of like religion? What is your idea of it? What's forming, like, why does a steeple exist? Like, that's just been a question for me, is like, as we go forward and even in these spaces. So like we've already talked about our embodied space, the digital space, and then where are we headed? What are we aimed at? What's this thing? And I kind of see them in a little bit like in the frame of ontology, epistemology, and teleology. Like, I think that this space is dealing with epistemics, what we know, what we understand. And when we're finding out more and more that when we drop back into life, that we are dealing with the fundamental reality of relationship that isn't always about ideas. Like I think earlier someone was talking about sitting with somebody in grief. My epistemology in that moment, my theological, like, you know, God has a plan for, don't say that. Like, yeah, but you're trying to like reach for the right idea
Mm.
when the person needs their
What's the
hand
right thing
held.
to say?
That,
That's what
a
we always
person,
want to do.
the person needs someone to sit with them and hand them a tissue or
Hmm.
just say this is horrible, without any answers. And to be honest, I don't talk about it a whole lot, but my full-time job is a registered nurse. I've been in the ICU
Mm.
for the last 6 years and watched a lot of people die and a lot of people witness their loved ones die in those kinds of situations. And so, to that point, yeah, that's um, there's an interesting time that happens related to that, and that's about presence, and so that's where it's like these spaces of being present, being with, singing with, standing, sitting, kneeling with, these kind of these kinds of things, and then we hop into these spaces that for the people that are hungry for theological precision or philosophical category, and we're able to do that in a way. But then even when you come back down in these spaces, so much of our idea of church was built on the ideas, which still is theologically, but the digital has like just completely eroded that. And so what are these places that we're in if the digital like just says, hey, I think we've got a Catholic and a Presbyterian and maybe another type of Presbyterian in the group here, and it's like, what are we doing right now? Because we're not talking about the distinctives of those faiths, and so um uh or even if we were, when we go back home, that's not really what we're doing when we're with those people in worship and in our life and our rhythms and our practices. So
Yeah, some of the strongest Protestants that I know of are uh, online orthobro and trad Catholics who are ex evangelicals,
Mhm.
and yeah, so much of the discussion there is about the emphasis being placed on metaphysics, which is also even kind of what I was getting back to earlier, where it's this emphasis on how do we police the institution when it's what you're describing, the phronema, the lived embodiment of the life of the spirit.
And thanks for that for both of you gents. What you described there, Christian, just brought to my mind the value, especially of TLC and S3 and that kind of face-to-face mode, but also then, as I mentioned, with our group in Ireland going hiking and things like that. Now, it's also Rabbi Jonathan Sachs used to talk about the shoulder to shoulder element too, and of course the extreme example that you gave is with dying people and those things, and to be a Christian in that particular way is something very different than this kind of very early fairy notion of metaphysical notions and so on, even though that obviously has its place. But
Mhm.
do you find that there is, given the breakdown of those kind of barriers and the access to information provided by the internet and the relationships that we are able to build up to whatever extent online and then in person, because of the likes of the kind of the media forms that we're talking about now, that there's a greater Catholicity within Protestants in places like the USA. So I listen to folks now increasingly like Jordan Cooper and even Redeem Zimmer, whom we mentioned, Gavin Ortland, some of those guys, that they are, when I had a conversation with Paul recently about the end of the age of Hitler, he talked about going into the basement. I thought that was a nice little thing. We might say the attic in this part of the world or what have you. And I think that's great. Somebody that's really deeply impressed me is Robert E. Weber, who was a kind of American evangelical Anglican liturgist, and I meant to have a conversation in a few days with Winfield Bevins. I don't know if either of you have come across Winfield, but he has written simply Anglican about this kind of Catholic turn within Protestants, and written about the liturgy and the importance of the arts and all these things. What opportunity do you think there is for folks today to live that integrated way of being, as you were describing earlier, Christian, rather than just going rad trad Catholic or Orthobro or what have you? I think as a little segue on that, in line with what you described, that I think that would fit within ressentiment, not to overdo the ressentiment
Yeah.
again, but people who are rejecting that heritage and just seeing all the negatives about it and focus inordinately on that and only the positives with Eastern Orthodoxy or what have you, and kind of creating virtues out of your vices. And we see that, I think, unfortunately, in many cases, and not for the betterment of God's kingdom, but we have to wrestle with the good and the bad in each of us and in each of these traditions and so on and so forth. And I would love, from my perspective, I would love to see Protestants uh, reintegrate and refocus on those things. But I think it can be done in a way in line with what Redeemed Zoomer and those guys are talking about. These pointing out the Presbyterian looks at all these beautiful Protestant churches and so on, and takes us beyond the kind of straw man of Protestants, just smoke machines and all this kind of stuff. I wonder if you guys would like to speak to that and your experiences or hopes or to that end.
Are you referring specifically like with the internet or just
Well, I
moving
think the
forward?
internet then vis-a-vis worship,
Hmm.
or then in relation to worship and focusing our attention on first things, ironically, then on the back of some of these divisive conversations on and how God can use that to um, form His church in a more Catholic manner, in spite of the kind of back and forth with the Jay Dyer kind of this internet age, and you know.
Yeah, there's that
And also,
concern that like what we're doing is we're interacting with each other again as avatars, and that we're doing that then even when we're talking about East and West,
Mhm.
right? When we're talking about these grand narratives, and that's it's such a huge problem that you know, creating identitarian narratives to then reduce someone. It's, I've shaped this box now. Please get in. And uh, and one of the issues with that is like that if you go back and like you're talking about people who want to out of resentment reject there's a great deal of self-loathing that's going on in a lot of those cases, and so it's like that was formerly what I was. So I see this a lot less with people who are cradle Catholic or Orthodox, because usually it's existing out of ignorance. Whereas in the other case, where you have some sort of conversion from Protestantism into Orthodoxy or into Catholicism, there's a sense of like that was the thing that I was, and so now that I'm over here, I need to there is there are new boundaries that need to be established and policed so that I can say I am not that thing any longer and reject that. And so quickly, how can I throw up an avatar of that version? And the internet, again, the internet makes that convenient because that's how we're taught and trained to interact with one another and to interact with narratives. And so I was talking to somebody recently he's trying to navigate where exactly he's going to, he's looking at Anglicanism, Catholicism, and Orthodoxy. And one of the things that I was encouraging him in was pursuing a small o mere orthodoxy, right? A mere Christianity, and realizing to what extent um, the things that the a lot of the metaphysical claims, or not necessarily the metaphysical claims, but like there's always the avatar of like, well, in the East we have mysticism, and in the West you have rationalism, and it's like I don't care on which side you actually fall in this tradition, but that bifurcation, historically speaking, is it just it, if you are it's very easy to create these avatars, especially for people who are intellectual intellectual historians, because I might have mentioned this before, where it's like we mistake the we mistake intellectual history for the history of intellectuals. And so we have a very select, narrow reading of historical figures that we want to draw from and be like, ah, this is the West. Ah, this is the East. And when you go into the actual literature back in history and find out, like, oh, here's Orthodox Russian Slavic systematic theology. Whoa, what's that doing over here? And then we come over to the West and we're like, wow, look at this deep Western mysticism that's present here. And so just encouraging them that wherever you are, go back and first establish the foundations and the appreciation. That was what you were getting at, Christian, with like loving your father. Go back and recapture that, and then let that guide you moving forward. And so in that sense, yeah, the internet it encourages us to create avatars of ourselves, other people, movements, historical narratives, but it also provides a giant melting pot of interactions that we otherwise wouldn't have. And that's where, we're able to get that metagelical experience, the stew that we can. You're talking about like Redeem Zoomer and other people who are all of a sudden like, well, actually, okay, interesting. There's something over here. We're able to actually get outside of our own our own quick drawn map for how we perceive reality, because we have to bump into other experiences. So in that regard, I think all of us here, we've experienced other people's lives in places completely different from our own, thanks in no small part to our experiences on the internet, and having to interact with that and be like, oh, this person is actually a thoughtful, engaging person who I have to take serious. So I guess it gets back to that sense of embodiment, and also, let the spirit that's guiding you be one of love for Christ ultimately. And that's, I mean, at one level, it's like the only thing that I have control over, and I struggle with this, is myself. So going online to correct other people's, theology and metaphysics is fine and is good at some level, but you kind of end up in the Jordan Peterson scenario of clean your own room. And it's like so many people want to save the world first, or police the borders to make sure that the spirit is the collective spirit is oriented in the direction that they want it to go in. So I guess, yeah, again, that's the be wary of the drive, the spirit of the machine.
Thanks, George.
All right. Are you ready?
I don't know.
Okay. So, as somebody that mentioned early in my introduction, but just like being a quote unquote worship leader for the majority of, my adult life, and having in the last almost 3 years started doing that after basically not for about 6.5 years, just sitting in the pew. This is the big question for me, Marcus. I mean, this kind of, I mentioned my family having Catholic roots, having Baptist and charismatic group, on my side, and my dad was raised Methodist, and his dad went into the holiness movement, downstream from, Whitfield and everybody, and then my wife raised Catholic and Lutheran, and I work with a guy who was ordained as a Presbyterian for 5 years, and like, oh man, what is all of this? Um, and so much of it has distilled in relationship to then getting on the internet and talking to people of all the stripes as well. What can I do, related to this question? And that's been being a moving away from this idea of being a worship leader to being a liturgical steward in a Protestant context. And so, you know, look at asking these questions again about, you were mentioning like the metaphysics, maybe of something like the Eucharist, and it's like, okay, so what do we do? Well, I can tell you, and there are thresholds to this, and but even in this conversation I had with Bob the Baptist was, um, what even in related to Paul Kingsnorth's book Against the Machine, something Peugeot said a long time ago to maybe it's David Fuller, who did the first documentary of Jordan Peterson, having rebel wisdom be his name. And he was like building on, Peugeot gave him a critique of, talked about building on something based about what you are against. And even the title Protestant, protest, like you're building your identity on what you are not and not what you are. Reformer, different idea. What are you reforming? And originally you're reforming Catholicity. So I think these things really matter and related to our identity and how we position ourselves and relate to others within this story of Christianity. And again, I would take from Peterson is not that it's only a story, but that it is also a story of, history of like, the story I point to is something like, as I'm part of a Presbyterian tradition, is like, well, that bloody, terrible situation between the Catholics and the Huguenots in France, like it's a terrible story. It's awful, but they're both a part of that story, and they actually now have a relationship because of that story. And it goes on to Marcus's neck of the woods after that. But it's like, it's these stories. Where do they come in? Like, there's a relationship to the Puritans and the Anglicans. Like, there's a relationship, that in 2025 doesn't mean the same thing. But to be able to sit in that story together and be able to even have that conversation, like we sit in this lineage, like start like a different kind of conversation. So that's one, is being like, and I think something related to Redeem Zoomer's thesis about mainline Protestantism is like being able to recapture that identity to be able to relate to the Christian story. And then we can have other conversations. It's a different conversation of talking about what to do about, like, or how big box evangelicalism then relates to that. I mean, it's another story, but it is, and it's a relationship, but it's not it's a false equivalency to say that they're the same. Mainline Protestantism's relationship to Catholicism is different than the kind of relationship of Southern Baptist big evangelicalism's relationship to it. It's like again, these like magnitudes of where you, and kind of framing these things. So then you can have, where are you at on that, and where does the story and where does the conversation happen at? And viewing it in that way, not just theologically, oh, well, here's our distinctives. And so there, it's like, okay. So then there's this question of liturgy, and how we're being formed and what's being pressed in upon us, and what's like igniting our what we imagine, like our children, but even ourselves. How do they imagine what it means to be a Christian? What it like, it's not just the ideas that they have about doctrine. It is how they experience Christianity itself in the world. And that happens a lot at church, whatever that means, at church, So, so then this question of relationship to, there's two things kind of going on, because we already mentioned Gerard, but like I think mimetic desire related to the historical architecture is built into things like video games, but that's formed a lot of people's imaginations that are moving to the rad trad movement related to playing games like The Witcher and games like Skyrim and games like in this kind of medieval imagination, and Dungeons and Dragons and whatnot. I think that there's actually a real, like, I think Gamergate was, ran underneath this cultural upheaval that doesn't get talked a lot about on a certain popular level, but it's like, I think it's connected. And then these people that understand how to operate well in the digital world have found their Skyrim church, and they are able to push out the mimesis of these grand, like, of super liberal churches, but they're a cathedral, and it's like, this is what we are, and they're a trad person, but they're like promoting some, church in, I don't know, somewhere in the world that they wouldn't agree with probably 90% of the congregation there, but they're like, but this is who we are. And it's this mimetic power of the image of that. So that's at play. And then it's like, well, I can say on the internet that I this is who I am. And they go to that church and they don't know anybody, or but they're just like, but they're in this kind of like, but I'm here and I'm in it. And however long that can last, and hopefully it turns into actual relationship. But I think that's something that I've imagined in my mind, is this kind of like what's going on because those forces are even powerful upon myself. So imagine being 20 and not having kids and not having like those kinds of responsibilities. And you can just like, be like, in George, you talked earlier on in the conversation about identity. And so again, these cultural forces like the religious identity, like, say you're against certain political things, and this religious doctrine from this ancient religious institution feels like a ballast, against the culture in a certain kind of way. So that's one thing happening. The other question is happening because, even some of the mystical sides of it, it's like people that have been in psychedelics are like, man, this Eastern Orthodoxy and the incense and like the conostasis, and I can get myself into kind of a, hesychatic, I think that's the word, state of being, like, and like, wow, now I'm and now this is connected to my religious faith. It's like, okay, I mean, those things are real, and I'm not even laughing at the Skyrim church thing. I'm not laughing at yoga church thing. I'm saying those things are real, like powerful embodiments of things that we experience. So then that asks the question of how then is there relationship more granularly between something like Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, Protestantism, Reform, the reformational ecclesial bodies. And I think re-engaging in something that quote unquote is as simple as the church calendar. And I think that evangelicalism will play with this more and more and more. You already see things like Phil Wickham and David Crowder, who like are not people that I take in their content for, like interest, musical reasons. But I watch what the leaders from Elevation Church, who recently did a collective, like it's their pastor, what's his name? Stephen Furtick, and his main worship leader. And then Chance, I think his name's from the kind of like the new wave gospel modern worship group Maverick City that came out that was very popular a few years ago. And then Leland from Leland was in this collective, and they're in Old Baptist Church. They're in this and they're all sitting in around, and they're recording these kind of raw songs. And so they're taking this aesthetic of kind of a nostalgic, kind of a something even for themselves, even though I'm skeptical of part of what they're doing, because a lot of it's about marketing, and it's about taking something that's happening in the zeitgeist and using it as a liturgical garnish to place upon a market and an entertainment industry. But at the same time, there's something true going on. And I just recently saw that the Philip Wickham and the David Crowder, it was just like on worship leader TikTok or Instagram, you just kind of see this stuff. And it's like, they were in this, at least it looked like an old Baptist church, and there were stained glass windows in the background. And then they're doing this like, energetic pop stuff, but they're taking this something going on related to a relationship to history. Everyone's feeling it all at the same time. That is something that's happening that's real, because even all of those people have gone off into this never-ending progress of innovation, are like spun out because the machine will do that to you. Everything that we've talked about earlier. I've experienced that myself and when I was in that world. And so there's this idea of taking liturgy or the historical and making it kind of a garnish on top of entertainment. But then there's also this question of what do we share? And I mentioned the church calendar. What do we share? Do we share Easter and Christmas? Do we share Holy Week? Do we share Advent? Do we share a recognition of a few of these other holy days upon the year? And instead of it being like theirs is like, a watered down tea version of that, it's like, hey, that's cool. We're together. Can we say that we're together? And, we're not making metaphysical claims right now, but we're saying like we're recognizing something together. Then to getting into more taking it down another levels, like then what is happening inside of those places and like, liturgically in the East and the West, like the culmination of the services, Eucharist, communion, Lord's Supper, the relationship that mainline Christianity can have to that is reclaiming and re-embodying that we are sharing that as the culmination of our worship together. And we can look across the fence to these other people and they can look across to us. And we don't have to even answer what is happening metaphysically in that moment. But are we actually, can we say that we are participating in something that we recognize in the embodied act of going forward to the altar, partaking in the body? And like, can we look and say we see? And again, they're they're kind of concentrics because then you get it. There's other elements of Christianity that are out like further, but it's like in these, and I think two really, at least for in the Reformed context, there are two really big names that need more recognition to begin working within the tools that are available to create a type of visible salience of participation, and is William Nevin and Philip Schaff. And Nevin wrote a book called The Mystical Presence, and he was a Presbyterian, and they together created something. They developed what's called Mercersburg theology, which was kind of like Presbyterians and German Reformed talking about a liturgy and talking about kind of even Calvin's view on what's the metaphysics of the Eucharist. And so then Schaff actually wrote and translated many of the modern church father works as a Reformed Presbyterian. Many of the people that read the church fathers are reading them as translated by someone who is Reformed. And so it's like, well, what's going on there? So, like there's a relationship. And not only that, but he had this idea about Catholic, he saw the church, the ideas of like Reformed Catholicity and some of the forms and the frames of these embodied spaces, and that the church is an organism, which again is a great ballast against the church as a machine, which is again with other things that we've been like talking about in this conversation. But I think those two figures for me, as I continue to explore them and their influence and their part of the story, are resources for people in different traditions outside of the East and the main Catholic and Eastern Orthodox that can develop language and an imagination for what worship can and liturgy can look like in their own kind of context.
Can I riff off of that real quick? Because you hit on something in there. I was like, oh man, yeah, I love that idea. That I think that there's been an awakening recently that the moral imagination is downstream from the sacramental imagination. I don't know if you've experienced that, where there's some sense of like, okay, my through what we've been talking about this whole time, our experience of reality has been so mediated through the internet, through this lens, this frame that, okay, it's like this is going to be your interaction with other human beings, with reality, with nature. I saw a video of somebody who was filming a whale jumping out of the ocean, and he was like, he's holding his camera here and looking at the camera, and so he was experiencing, he wasn't even looking at it. And there's been an increasing sense of like if we were to recapture the moral imagination and understand, okay, how do we shape that? What colors it? What drives it? It ultimately has to be sacramental, and that I loved what you were getting at there with that. And we ask, okay, well, what does that look like? That involves a recognition that my eternal soul is hungry for an experience with the eternal, and that I experience that in the liturgy, in the Eucharist, and in liturgical participation through the yearly calendar, like you're talking about. And I think this is also why, even just with the Instagramification of imagery, why we're seeing such a rebirth and interest in sacred art. And there's a desire to see reality not just as a series of quick clicks, but also to see it as something that has an eternal end, and that this is that eternal end is something that it is participating in now, and that when I see, I look at the tree, I look at my wife, I look at the creek behind my house, and I see water. I see a woman, I see a tree, and I see these things sacramentally with an eternal end that then allows me to then come back into the present and see them anew. And I think that's what you're getting at. And I'm like that I think that's the way forward.
Yeah, can Protestants have a cosmic image?
Oh, I think
As a
there's hunger for that. There's an awakening for that, and I think it's because of the cheapening of our experience of reality.
Yeah. I think in reference again to, I even think sacred music, I mean, it goes back to two things. I mean, video games play a big part of it too, because going back even to like Castlevania in the 80s, and like there's like the relationship to Bach and the relationship to how some of these influences have played into soundtracks, that a lot of young men listen to video game music as their musical engagement. And it's has a lot closer relationship to sacred music than it does to modern pop music. But what has been the most prolific in, Christianity for the last almost 30 years though now has been Christian pop music. And again, I don't want to be too critical of that, because honestly, I think that it has, like, in a culture, we kind of want there to be a level where there is some kind of relationship to the sacred in our popular culture, but in kind of the right place where, and I had this experience when I went to a Symbolic World 2 years ago, when Dirt Poor Robins, which he has an interesting story, Neil DeGrade, their lead singer, and his wife, Kate, they used to produce music in CCM, and even though their personal music was more kind of avant-garde, but like he worked a lot with groups like Sovereign Grace, which Bob Kauflin and the Midwest and that movement. But they did this rock concert on Friday night, and then Saturday was straight like conference, and then Sunday everyone went to like Divine Liturgy, and I was like, wow, rock music has doesn't rock music feel like it belongs on Friday night? Just like, Garth Brooks at the amphitheater on a Friday night. Like, isn't that feel like more where it belongs than 9 a.m. on a Sunday morning? Like 9 a.m. on a Sunday morning. I did rock and pop music at 9 a.m. on a Sunday morning for years. And it's like, I'm trying to get people 4 on the floor, boom, boom, boom. What's up, everybody? Welcome to worship. We're so glad you're here today. We want to really invite you to worship the Lord today, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, I'm doing something that's not what that time is for. But it doesn't mean that doesn't have a time. And so I think that there's a relationship there that, and even Neil becoming Eastern Orthodox, and he's speaking of Jay Dyer. He just was on some like private plane, and they were going somewhere to do some Orthodox promotion, something or another. It's just funny to watch, like, the way that we propagate our movements and the things we believe in also looks really similar. Like I saw that Neil's doing a youth conference, like an Orthodox youth conference in Texas somewhere. And I was like, the ads went out for it and the banner and the flyer. And I was like, man, this looks really familiar. Now, granted that he's not leading worship on their Sunday morning event, but it's like, there's what's going on there? There's something going on there. And it's not a critique. It's like trying to recognize something real in how the relationship to this stuff. So,
Mhm. That's great. Thank you both so much. It's music to my ears before the fun. And from my perspective, listening to that, it brought a couple of things to mind. So one being the great Lutheran writer Eugen Rosenstock-Huessy, who Peter Leithart is doing wonderful work to help retrieve. He has been so helpful to me. There's about three key figures from Catholic, Protestant, Reform, let's say, and Eastern Orthodox backgrounds in the 20th century. All converts from Judaism, funny enough, too, which is interesting. So it would be Eugen Rostock-Huessy, Ivan Illich and Alexander Men, I think, are the three of the most profound Christian thinkers, beings of the 20th century, and so much to teach us. But one thing from Eugen is that distinct emphasis on the calendar and the importance of calendars and how this changes your whole perspective and our appreciation of reality and so on. It brought to my mind too the difference that Malcolm Gate speaks about. We're thinking about people who speak to the imagination, the power of the imagination. He talks about comprehension versus apprehension and returning to that apprehension, that kind of cosmic image that you describe. I think that's very powerful, and I think those folks have really helped me, even beyond Bach and folks like that who you mentioned. In terms of the visual arts, there's different, like the African American visual artist, Henry Osawa Tanner, and folks like that. I think is as beautiful as things you would have seen in the Middle Ages and so on. That we don't get caught up in things have to be done, say, in a Gothic mode, or things have to be done according to the Eastern Orthodox Divine Liturgy and da da da. But you can appreciate the good and all these different emphases. That's increasingly how I've come to appreciate it over the years. And I'm kind of curious, in line with that, what you folks maybe, is there anything where you have experienced God's beauty made manifest in the world recently in a way that is marked and outside the norm? So just to give you from my own perspective, within a kind of more reformed setting and within a more Roman Catholic setting. So in Sicily, where my wife and I were going to the Baroque churches and seeing every little detail offered to God with the precision that they do and the wonderful coming together of all these eclectic figures and so on. I think that really spoke to me about God's beauty and made manifest in the world. And even let's throw in the Eastern Orthodox background as well. It's coming back to the Christian faith myself in my 20s. I was deeply impressed with the basic notion of Eastern Orthodox iconography, that God can be known through matter, and that it gives ultimate significance to matter. It doesn't mean you have to get on board with everything in terms of Eastern Orthodox iconography, and it need not be kind of mandatory in your liturgy and so on, but you can appreciate that God can be known through matter. And then, even within the kind of Methodist context, go into a Christmas service and joining the congregation in singing the hymns of Charles Wesley and experience God in that way audibly, and in that participation. Each of those has been remarkably um, edifying to me. And again, hopefully, we're giving glory to God in proper fashion and so on. And I think that's a healthy way of viewing it, especially what you described with in terms of Reformed Catholicity, and you hear that term thrown about by Dr. Kevin Van Hooser and folks like that, Christian. But is there anything that springs to mind in terms of recently for either of you gents that you have experienced God very powerfully in the arts or in liturgy, and that you'd like to share with us?
yeah, this is maybe a little bit outside the box, but I've had two moments in the last 2 years that were really grounded in just like real earthy experiences that were extremely beautiful to me. And I had this sense that there's nowhere else in the world that I want to be than right here in this moment. And one of those was recently it was both putting up and taking down Christmas lights at my house with my son. He's 8, about to be 9, and he was bugging me. All the lights are going up in our neighborhood, and it's before Thanksgiving, and he's like, "Why are people skipping Thanksgiving and going straight to Christmas lights?" And and again, we're talking about calendar here. Like he's sensing something. It's coming alive, and having had some memories now. And then I was like, "All right, the Sunday after Thanksgiving, we're going to put up Christmas lights." Uh, and he wanted to help me. He's like, "Dad, I want to climb the ladder with you and get up there and hang these lights." And he did everything I asked of him. And I didn't even ask him for his help, which was the most glorious part of it, because that just kind of ruins it. So I need you to, he wanted to be with me because he also could see this is something that Dad does. Mom doesn't get on the roof and put up Christmas lights. Dad gets on the roof and puts up Christmas lights. And he just was so excited. It was a cold day. His hands were getting numb, and he was like, "Dad, oh man," he's like, "it'll feel so good to go inside and like get warm when we're all done." But he didn't want to go inside till we were done. And I just was so struck by the beauty of this simple act that drew us together, that does have a relationship to the cosmic order even. But it's like in this calendar, and like there was just no other place I wanted to be than setting up Christmas lights with my son, because he was like, was it a little annoying to me? Yeah, to get out in the cold and do that. But to just see him want to do that with me, like something that's a little bit of work. And then the same thing happened when we took him down. It was just like he's like, I want to help take these down off the columns on our front porch, and take them down. And he's like, "Dad, I want to try to do it." It was beautiful. It was just absolutely, I don't even know how we got there. And then 2 years ago, there were some tornadoes that came through, and we were just getting our little church, kind of our little Presbyterian church going, and one of our leaders' house got completely, in his farm, kind of like really taken by this tornado that went through about 10 miles from where we live. And so we had a work day, a church work day out there. And it was like the first time that, this group of 30 people, we had like this really serious reason to help somebody in our church, our little burgeoning church, and I've had that same experience being out there helping. I was like, gosh, there's nowhere else. There's just nowhere else I want to be in this moment. A lot of times we're distracted and we want other things, or like, this is boring, or that's too much, that's too hard, but having those two moments were like, they just struck me, because it's not something that I could have like planned, but they were in these relationships and these communities that were directly connected to this little sacramental body, this, like, whether it's the family, whether it's our church. And so those would be the two. And that kind of goes through, because it felt like, some of these things, like Andrew Peterson's publishing house, he's a great Christian, storyteller, singer-songwriter, writer, author, creative. And he has helped publish these two books, Every Moment Holy, where these written liturgies for different events. And those are the kinds of things where you can offer up, even you can take a moment to take like those not weird, but those moments. You could even give them a liturgical moment even within those, which I wanted to on the farm. I wasn't going to do it in our house, just me and my son, but I wanted to on the farm. And there were some other kind of like reasons that it didn't ever happen, but I could just kind of sense that was where those beauties, but how that doesn't be weird is if you already have that kind of in your bones a little bit, and that flows down from your the way in which you attend to worship. And so those are two, and just that, like you were talking about the um I'll give this one other story, but we've moved into this church that was built in like 1956 in the style of an old Anglican church from like Williamsburg. It's very small, seats about 150 people in these pews. And there's an old organ that was put together by somebody from the Netherlands back in the 60s in our little town. He flew over and built this organ in this building. It's an old Christian Science, if you've heard of that sect in America, that we are inhabiting, that is, or that we are reconquisting, if you want to. I'm Redeemed Zoomer would still call me a schismatic because I'm not PCUSA, but we are reconquisting from the Gnostics, this building that was based off of a mainline church building, and it looks like the Presbyterian chapel at our college and the first Presbyterian church in our town, and it has this giant organ in the back that I still play acoustic guitar on Sundays. I'm not like high classical music bro. But we have a young man who's very musically talented. Been playing piano since he was like 5. And I was like, Henry, do you think you could get up there on Christmas Eve and play a few carols on the organ? We haven't used it. We've been in here for almost a year. And that was really exciting to like inhabit that space as it was intended in this, new time. And just to kind of riff on your Charles Wesley moment as well with matins and whatnot. So
wonderful. Thanks, Christian. What about yourself, George?
Yeah. I think that through thinking more about the importance of having a sacramental and liturgical imagination has really helped bring to the forefront the relationship between the sacred in creation. Thinking especially about like the incarnation and the effects of that on our material being and on us as humans, and like what are the implications of that, both in God becoming man, having the universal becoming particularized, but then also what does it mean to participate in that, in that life as human beings, and then thinking particularly on the role of his mother, Mary, and her participation in that. Rowan Williams has some fantastic works on sacred art, and also just looking at the images and interactions between Mary, because she's almost always portrayed with Christ, either as an infant or Christ alongside her, or there's an encompassing there where it's like she is fully human but is called to bring forth God in the world. And you think about that, just like, wow, what does that mean? What are the implications of that to me? So we're all supposed to imitate Christ, right? Christ. So we have the universal, we've got the eternal that is God that becomes a particular man that we're supposed to imitate in our own particularity. And then looking at his mother as an example of that, also for us to imitate. And what are the implications of that, where you have a woman who is completely consumed by the eternal so that she brings it forth. And it's like, what are the implications, the ramifications of that for me? And then experiencing Advent and the lead up to Christmas completely anew. And then even a couple of years back with the birth of my daughter, and looking at her, and it's wild to try to think what would this person look like? What would this infant look like from a purely materialistic perspective? But then seeing her and seeing the almost the infinite within her, and that, it's like, wow, that's mind blowing, and our participation in this eternality, and experiencing that, particularly especially in the liturgy, in personal prayer, being like, okay, that this is soulcraft for participation in that, and that it's for participation in eternality that is yet to come, but that is also present already, so that when you are sitting down with your child, I forget that there was I think it was a Russian theologian who would light a candle between himself and another person when they were having a dialogue to represent the Holy Spirit between them, and feeling that presence of the eternal there. It's like experiencing that anew, or in a fresh way, such that it's just impressed upon you. Where it's like, wow, that eternality, that's here, right now, with this person, with this little girl, and that there's some sort of that eternality means there's almost this weird sense of like there's something old here because it's timeless, and yet she's fresh. She's just here. She's just emerged here. And then feeling the weight of the responsibility of that experience. You're like, wow, what are the duties that I have to take on in my engagement with this? And then being like, shoot, I better go pray. And engage in that liturgy, and in that yearly devotion, that yearly practice, that yearly formation, engaging in these rites and practices of cultivating your attention, right? It's the cultic practices, right, of cultivation, and then feeling that at times, like, yeah, like the midnight Christmas service. And you're like, wow, okay, I'm the eternal time is collapsing into this moment where I am experiencing it, such that when the Eucharist is being offered up, it's not that Christ is being sacrificed again, but that it's like we're there present at the initial sacrifice. And then going out from there and being like, okay, take that with me. And I guess re-experiencing the obligations and the weight of that glory. Even when you're looking at like a tree then, and like I was talking about earlier, and seeing its future end as in a sacramental way, and in seeing it in its participation in treeness, and its participation in the Christ's cross, and so I guess it's re-experiencing reality all the time, and so thinking about this particularly with we just got through Christmas and feeling it there. I said the birth of my daughter, and even in prayer and liturgy and in sacred art in general, just as a continual renewal of that on a daily basis. It's kind of a deepening appreciation for that.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, gents. And so I could talk to you both at length for hours and hours, but I appreciate your time, and I'm going to draw us to a close quite shortly. But I wanted to give you both the opportunity to tell us a bit about your respective ministries. So you've mentioned a bit about your family life, about your local church life, and so on. But I'd also like you to share, if you wish to, about say the George Buchanan Forum on your end, George, and or other such things. And likewise, Christian, if you'd like to tell us about yours truly and what you hope to achieve with that going forward and so on. To speak to you first, George.
Yeah, so with the George Buchanan Forum, the conference that we do, it is locally focused, and the talks are put up online, and so other people can hopefully enjoy them, give feedback, and be enriched by them. But what we're trying to do through that is, in some ways, provide. It's sort of similar to Estuary, but it's different. It's obviously it's a conference which has its own symbolism, right? And trying to open up conversations that otherwise are not being had, or to come at them from an angle that we think is being neglected, and to also help provide platforms for people within the local context. So this is it that provide a platform for people who perhaps otherwise wouldn't have a microphone, or people don't know, hey, there's this expert here in this topic. Let's bring them forward to help shape our collective narrative and identity making, our meaning making. And it is local, which means that there is an embodiment to it. And we probably the worst thing that could happen to us would be like if all of a sudden we became swamped with thousands of excited locals who wanted to attend it, because we're the goal is to keep it to a certain human scale, keep it under that Dunbar number, so that we can actually continue to know one another, engage with each other. I see these people outside of the George Buchanan Forum. So that collective meaning making continues outside of the event itself. And it mentioned that there's an emphasis there on like political theology, history, and economics. And so questioning what are the narratives that we currently self-identify through, and asking us what are the narratives that we ought to actually be forming our identities around, because it's so easy to just accept the ones that are handed down to us either by the state, by the machine, which has its own interests and its own goals. And a lot of times those are not conducive either for us living as human beings or living in community with one another, right? It's some level completely antithetical to the interests of the the empire. So figuring out, okay, what are the narratives that we've been given that maybe need to be rethought, reconsidered, and then how then ought we to live with new identities and narratives going forward from here. So that's kind of the focus of the George Buchanan Forum. And if anyone listens to it and profits from it and has feedback or thoughts as far as like topics, we're always open to that, because we have quite an impressive array of people here locally who actually are able to speak to these topics, which is kind of I know that's a unique function of where I'm at locally, and not a lot of people have that. So just trying to actually then bring that into the community at a more regular level.
That's great. Thank you so much, George. Yourself, Christian?
Yeah, I'm writing down some notes here because I don't know if I've totally thought through kind of transitioning. I just today, this morning, crossed 1,000 subscribers on my YouTube channel.
Congratulations.
Thanks. I put out a little post about it. And again, we've hit on that. What does that mean? Numbers and metrics, and number go up, and attention. And Paul Vanderklay has really harped on in the past about, do we really know what these numbers mean? And Marcus has been running a YouTube channel now for, I don't know, 4 or 5 years, maybe 3, 4, 5 years.
Now, yeah.
6. Wow. So, having a relationship to that. So I think with Christian Baxter, yours truly, which is the title of, I guess, the podcast and the name and the brand, all those words. I guess trying to continue to kind of examine these relationships to kind of hierarchy and what the digital has done to them, and how that works with, like, when you have a number next to your name, and certain people might be a little more willing to come to have a conversation with you, but you also started having conversations with people 2 years ago when that number wasn't by your name, and what does that mean, and what are those relationships like? And I think another piece of that puzzle related to trying to digitally embody or continue being an expression of something like this little corner of the internet's culture, digital culture, trying to continue that. Something that's in the kind of podcast ish world is these randos conversations that Paul is kind of infamous for, where this isn't going to get you more clicks or more reach or status, but it speaks to some I mean, it does several things, but to continue to try to honor that, I think that's part of that model, that kind of walking in the dust of your rabbi. Shout out to Rob Bell. Like, what is discipleship? Is what does it mean to follow in somebody's footsteps that way? And I think that's one of his most impactful things is the randos conversation. So, and then, but to continue to reach out and have conversations, build relationship to other channels or networks, just like this one with Marcus and with you, Georgia, who I had on the podcast about 6 months ago, um, and others, like recent conversation with Daniel from OG Rose and what he's doing. I've been in multiple conversations with Brennan Graham Dempsey and Metamodernism, been in conversations with Cadell Last with his philosophy portal, and finding certain kind of resonances. Again, those are like they're not, Cadell Christian atheism, and with Zizek and philosophy and capitalistic communism with a lot of who's the synthesis, antithesis, thesis, who's the philosopher that he's really
Hegel?
connected.
Hegel.
Yeah, Hegelian space that he does. And continue to build those kind of relationships in this space, whatever it's become a part of, because it goes back to me for this. There was a certain, experience that I had in that as the church existed, at least in my context, almost 10 years ago, did not have great answers for something that I experienced. And somebody that actually had better answers was Jordan Peterson. That's not to say that he had all their answers, but, there's something like, well, he has some heretical ideas, or he doesn't call himself a Christian. But what he is saying is that all of our civilization, that as we know it, is built off the Bible. Like, that's a pretty bold statement for somebody that's not a Christian, and I can get on board with that. What else he's saying is like some of the deepest, most profound psychological realities that we can understand are found in this book of Genesis. And like the experience that I had was related to a story in Genesis around Abraham. And so it's like, okay. And I felt like it was a psychological, spiritual, whatever you want to put the words around. So it's like, that's why I want to continue having conversations with kind of these people that necessarily would say, I am a Christian, called Christian. I will go in there and say that. But so there's something there for me on that, related to continue to have discourse and dialogue, and then continuing to refine my own ideas about kind of Reformed Catholicity, liturgical stewardship, and even the questions of related to, which we didn't hit on. We contemplated hitting on more of the religio-political conversations that are happening within the discourse. I'm continued to be interested in that, and then how then these things land back into my embodied life, these ideas and these ideals and these conversations, and then it happen at this digital speed that not everybody in my church or in my community are cruising at, and so learning how to continue to have that kind of relationship, and over time I had this experience with when I had this Christian worship rock band, whatever, and then I had my church band. And my Christian rock band was made of these guys that were tapped in. They were excellent. One of them is now, he plays drums for a lot of people. Like, he arranged the opening number for the Dove Awards, and he, this past year, which is kind of the Christian version of the Grammys. And then, he also he sells out. He's a drummer selling out arenas for one of the bigger Christian rock acts, and another guy's an executive at Columbia Records, and these were the guys in my band in their early 20s, and they were excellent, and we were cruising at a very high speed, and then my church was cruising at a different speed with the music that we were cultivating. But over time, I saw these things start to come together, and it was on like a 5-year time scale. And so when I think about like what's going on here and in my life, like I kind of have seen that pattern play out in a certain way. And so I'm curious how that will continue to if I keep having these high speed, conversations where I'm like, even in my band, like at that point when those guys started playing with me, I was like the least talented person. And that's how I always feel like with my library and my receipts, my theological or philosophical, or, I'm terrible. I'm trying to get better. I was like, oh, what's his name? His name was Reefed. And I'm going to, the guy on electric, I was like, I'm going to get some receipts in here. Like I'm literally, that's what I was trying to like get better at in this conversation. And so, Creefed, I think was his name. So yeah, I always feel like I'm having a high speed conversation, but I'm like I'm the, I don't know, whatever, not the sharpest tool having that conversation. And so it's, but regardless, like gaining so much from it. And yeah, just will continue, hopefully, to reach out and have these conversations in these different spaces. And, yeah, and some of that will grow the channel. Some of that will get clicks and, and more people become members and, but hopefully trying to keep that as, like there being openness to that conversation about how that's at play, as well. So there's a lot there, but anyways, thank you, Marcus.
Welcome to millennial imposter syndrome.
Yeah, thank you so much, folks. God bless you both in your respective ministries, and I pray that you maintain that convivial spirit and orient towards God's kingdom in your own distinct ways, and I hope it bears good fruit for all involved. Thank you so much, Saints.
Yeah, thanks, thank Marcus. You. And I've definitely profited from both of y'all's work. So thank you guys.
I'm going there. Nobody can stop me. Ooh, I'm going there. Don't you want to go too? I'm going there. Nobody can stop me. I'm on my way. I'm going there. I'm going there. Nobody can stop me. Ooh, I'm going there. Don't you want to go too? I'm going there.
If you'd like to join us in the More Christ community, you can do so by becoming a patron over on Patreon, or you can support by becoming a member on YouTube. Either way, you'll get early access to new episodes, receive free ebooks each month, and are able to ask More Christ guests some of your burning questions. Thank you to my sponsor, Sheer Blooms. Sheer Blooms provides flower hire across Britain and Ireland.